Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Can you see and hear me? I hope so. Yes, excellent. Hi, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this event on a Monday, a hot Monday. I hope you're fine where you are. I'm Sam Avanzo-Windet. I am a Deputy Director at the Learning and Work Institute, and I shall be chairing for the next hour as we talk about the current recruitment crisis and rise in economic inactivity across the UK. Now, I hope none of you have been fooled by the title, Ending the Current Recruitment Crisis, because we're not talking about the Prime Minister appointing his ministerial team. So let's just get that out the way early on. What we're talking about is the rise in economic inactivity that's been happening across the UK since the start of the pandemic. So we're going to, I won't steal any more of Stephen Evans's thunder, the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, because he will be presenting the findings of our new report that's been released today to talk us through the situation as it stands in the labour market. We're also going to be joined by the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Jonathan Ashworth MP, who will give us his reflections on the situation, and he'll also be setting out the Labour Party's response to it in the lead up to the conferences later in autumn. We'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end, so I hope that you'll be typing them out all the way through the discussion today. I'll come to those at the end and pose any questions to our two speakers. We also have a hashtag participation gap. If you're going to be tweeting throughout the event all of the interesting findings that we're going to share with you. So please do tweet, please do type your questions. Without further ado, I will pass over to Stephen Evans to set out the findings of our new report. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Good afternoon, everybody. So we got vacancies at record levels of job-to-job moves, difficulties filling key roles and with recruitment and retention. This is, as Sam alluded to, both a description of the last week in government, but also of the labour market more generally. The labour market feels hotter than the weather at the moment. And yet, despite all of that, despite those difficulties recruiting or filling roles, I mean, recruitment is at record levels, but employers are still finding it really tough. And yet employment in the UK is still below pre-pandemic levels. So the report we've published today and the event that we're sort of holding now is trying to square that circle and understand what's going on. Why have we got that employment gap despite all the challenges in the labour market and the record levels of recruitment? How do we compare internationally, and what can we do about this? So three quite easy questions for an hour on a Monday evening. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So this tells us a little bit of the story of things through the pandemic. So you can see that the blue line is GDP, and there's this huge drop in the second quarter of 2020. Total hours worked drop at the same rate, so about a 20-odd% fall, something like that. And yet the employment rate, the green line, it drifts down a bit, but by nowhere near as much as the blue line. And what this is telling us is that the furlough scheme and other economic and employment support introduced by the government helped to save millions of jobs. In fact, we estimate that if employment had fallen in line with the drop in GDP, then unemployment would have been about 2.5 million higher than it was. So this is the good news. Furlough helped to save millions of jobs. But if we move on to the next slide, the jobs recovery, the employment recovery has been weak, relatively weak, and weaker than in many other countries. So this chart shows changes in employment rate, percentage point changes in employment rates now compared to before the pandemic. So you can see most of these countries that we've looked at, we tried to look at the G7 countries and then some other European countries and other comparators as well. So we tried to get a decent basket of 10 countries here. So most of those countries have got employment rates now that are higher than they were before the pandemic. It's just the USA and the UK that has lower employment rates than before the pandemic, and the UK has that the biggest drop in employment rates in the G7. So we look like a little bit of an outlier here. We've got that bigger drop in employment rates than all other G7 countries, and it's only us in the US that's got lower employment rates overall. So we thought, well, what's going on? How can we explain this? An explanation one might be, well, maybe unemployment is worse in the UK and has risen by more. But if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that, in fact, that's not the case. So most countries saw a rise in unemployment through the pandemic and then a subsequent drop. The size of those changes and the starting points of each country vary. So much bigger rises in Canada and the US, for example, where they didn't really have furlough type schemes. So unemployment insurance really took the hit, if you like, whereas in the UK and some of the European countries, it's things like furlough. But every country, or almost every country on this chart, including the UK, now has unemployment rates below what they were pre-pandemic. So it's not rises in unemployment or a higher unemployment rate than other countries that explain why the UK's employment rate has dropped by the most of the G7 countries and of the 10 countries in total that we studied. So if we go on to the next slide, we can start to see what some of the answer is here. So this is the number of people who are economically active in the UK. So they're either in work or they're looking for work. And what you can see here is that when we got onto spring 2020, when the first lockdown started, the economically active population dropped. And in fact, we've got 1 million fewer people in the workforce than if pre-pandemic trends had continued. So we've got this big drop in the workforce, the potential workforce available. And we'll come on in a minute to why that is and what's driving this drop. But it's that million shortage, that shrinking UK labour force, that's really squaring that circle of lower employment than we had pre-pandemic, but record vacancies and employers filling vacancies, but struggling to get all the people that they need. So if we go on to the next slide, this puts the UK in some international context. So these are percentage point changes in economic activity rates between now compared to pre-pandemic. So this is percentage point changes in economic activity, so people either in work or looking for work. And you see a similar picture to the employment rate chart that I showed before. The UK, by far the biggest drop out of those countries, and most of those countries have seen rises in economic activity rates compared to pre-pandemic. Now, in the report itself, I'm sure we can pop a link in the chat for you, but in the report itself, we do talk about the starting points for different countries. So it's important to be really clear that the UK had relatively high employment and economic activity rates before the pandemic. So we were a relatively high base. I mean, by far not the highest employment rates or activity rates. Other countries like Japan and the Netherlands and Germany, for example, doing better than us. So it's not like we were truly world leading, but we were certainly doing better than some of the other countries here. So you have to take those starting points into account. But nonetheless, if we look at changes from the start of the pandemic, that almost 1 percentage point drop in the UK economic activity rate compares really poorly to these other countries. So let's try and have a bit of a look at what are some of the reasons for this. Why have we got this shrinking workforce? Why have we got a worse performance than other countries? So if we move on to the next slide, please. I'm channeling my inner Chris Whitty here. Next slide, please. So we've got here the reasons that people give for being economically inactive, and there's two phases really. So this is showing the change in economic inactivity by reason since the start of the pandemic, and there's a couple of different phases here. So in the early part of the pandemic, that first sort of 6 months or so, you see growth in people economically inactive for other reasons. Now that's going to be primarily people who are not looking for work because of the lockdown, so there will be reduced job opportunities. They might want to stay at home for health reasons. Also, the lockdown restrictions, it's literally illegal to to leave your home more than once a day, unless for particular reasons. So you got that growth in other reasons during the first lockdowns, but also look at that blue bar as well. This is rising economic inactivity due to being a student. So we have more young people staying in full-time education. Now this happens in every recession. Young people stay more likely to stay in education because there are fewer job opportunities available. It's also potentially a good thing as long as the education is high quality, given that we've got lower staying on rates at 16 and 17 than many other countries. So there can be some good reasons for that rise there. But it's really mid-2021 onwards that I'm most concerned about. And that's when you get growth in inactivity fueled by the purple bar there in particular, which is long-term sickness, and also to a lesser extent the orange bar, which is the number of people, this is working age people who say they've retired early. So that growth in long-term sickness is a real concern, up by 10% since the start of the pandemic. There are now twice as many people who are out of work, economically inactive due to long-term sickness than there are unemployed people, twice as many. So we've had this big growth in long-term sickness in particular. And then if we look at age on the next slide, please. So again, look at that 50 to 64 bar, by far the biggest growth in economic inactivity, older people leaving the workforce. You can see younger people, that's the staying in education thing that I was talking about before. The other thing to note on this chart, I think, is that all the blue bars are increases in activity. So for men, on every age group, there's been a rise in the numbers economically inactive, whereas the red bars, women, there are declines amongst those 18 to 49-year-olds, rises amongst younger people and older people. So there's a kind of male-female thing going on here, but also particularly that 50 to 64-year-old group. And we know something about this group because the ONS have done some really good research. And of those in their 50s, I think about 60% say that they would be interested in coming back to work, but it would have to be a flexible job that met their skills needs and kind of fitted the lifestyle that they wanted to have. Those aged 60 and above are more likely to say, yeah, I'm just retiring. So there's a bit of a narrative that says, oh, well, you know, older people, they've kind of reappraised their life during the pandemic and they've just had enough of work. They wanted to get out. They've got enough money to live off, whether that's drawing down their pension or partner's income, whatever it happens to be. You know, that is what it is. And yet the survey evidence is telling us that particularly those in their 50s, they're really interested in coming back, but it's got to be the right job for them. So the other point, I guess, is, well, is this a UK phenomenon, or actually is this sort of 50 plus people around the world are just saying, you know what, I've had enough, I've got enough money, I'm going to drop out of the labour force now, I've reappraised my options during the pandemic. So that's one thing we looked at for this report. And the next slide shows that, unfortunately, again, the UK looks like a bit of an outlier here. So most of these countries that we looked at have had increases in economic activity rates amongst those aged 55 plus. We end up with slightly different age groups for data reasons. So they're either flat or they've increased. Whereas look at the UK there, with that blue bar heading down for those 55 to 64-year-olds and the other two age groups as well. So either those over 50s in the UK are uniquely fed up of work and have uniquely saved up enough money not to have to worry about it, or we've got a bit of an issue here. And my contention, given the way you phrased it, you won't be surprised to hear, is it's the latter. So I'll come on to this in a second, but I do think there's a kind of, there's a big challenge here because, again, that ONS survey that I talked about, it's got some really brilliant data in it, and it shows only a minority of those over 50s who've dropped out of the workforce. Only a minority of them are on universal credit or unemployment related benefits. So the job centre isn't calling them in and isn't offering them support, because Job Centre Plus and employment support is increasingly targeted on those who are unemployed and on benefits. And you see this with the government's Way to Work campaign that it's had over the last 6 months, where they declared a couple of weeks ago that this had been a success. They'd hit their target of 500,000 people off benefits and into work. I'd really like to see some definitions and some supporting data rather than just a stated claim, but that's probably an issue for another webinar. But I think the key point is that that's focused on people who are unemployed and claiming benefits, whereas our big problem in our labour market is over 50s dropping out of the workforce altogether and not claiming those benefits, so they're not getting Job Centre Plus support. And this is different to the pattern that we see in other countries. So the furlough scheme worked really well, helped protect millions of jobs. That's great. But since then, and particularly mid-2021 onwards, we've seen this downward drift in employment in the UK, employment rates, that is not mirrored in other countries. And it's driven by people, particularly over 50s and those with long-term sickness, dropping out of the labour market altogether. And the UK is almost unique in seeing that pattern. Other countries are not seeing that pattern. So there's something going on here and we can do something about it. So last slide just starts to try and trigger off some thoughts about what we could do about this. I'm very interested in everybody else's thoughts on this. So first is we need to understand a bit more about what's going on and some of the dynamics and what might tempt people back and how we can do some of this. It's probably not a great surprise for an organisation that does research to call for further research, but sometimes it is true. And if anyone is keen to work with us on this, then please do let us know, because we think there's a bit more work to be done here, specifically with over 50s and people with long-term sickness directly, to understand this a bit more in a bit more detail. But secondly, I think there's a really big role for employers here. If employers are struggling to recruit, employers need to think about how they're recruiting, and I know many are doing so. So how are employers trying to find people? We've got a really rich talent group here who've dropped out the labour market altogether. So you don't find them through the standard ways. They're not looking at online jobs boards or going into the job centre. So how can we go and find people? How can we go and show them the jobs on offer? How can you as employers go and find them? And job design comes into it as well. So, you know, how do we design jobs so that they can fit the flexibility and fit around work and home life in the way that people over 50 who've dropped out the labour force are saying that's one of the things that would tempt me back. So how do we look at job design? But thirdly, policy. So we've estimated in this report that there's probably about a £2 billion underspend in the plan for jobs. And you can see some of the figures here. So most of it's coming from Kickstarts, which, you know, has done a lot of very good stuff, but has had 160,000 placements as opposed to, I think, 250,000 originally aimed for. Restarts, which was a programme set up for the long-term unemployed, and thankfully, in part thanks to the success of furlough, we haven't had such a rise in long-term unemployment, but that means that programme's underspending significantly. And then traineeships, where the government wanted to provided funding, I think, to double the number of apprenticeships in 2021 or the following year as well. And I think, in fact, only managed to increase it by about 5% or something. So enormous underspends going back from the Department for Education to the Treasury. So we've got this big underspend. Now, our argument is that we should refocus this and reinvest it in the problem we've actually got, which is over 50s and those with long-term sickness dropping out the labour market, rather than saying, hurrah, we've had a great success, unemployment is very low. It is genuinely good that unemployment's low, but it's not good that this is partly because we've got an incredible shrinking workforce. We need to reinvest this money and refocus policy. We need to do something different, given that previous employment programmes have worked less well for the over 50s. So we've got some thoughts about that. I'm sure you all will do as well. I guess the very last thing I'll say before I stop is that why does this matter? I mean, it really matters for individual opportunity. It matters to prevent long-term poverty problems, because if people are spending their pensions now, we're potentially storing up pensioner poverty problems. It matters for employers who need people, they need a workforce in order to succeed and grow, but it matters for the economy as well. Economic growth since 2008 has been rubbish, as a technical economist term. It's been diabolical. And this is not just a natural fact of life. We can do something about this. One of the ways we can do something about it is by growing our labour supply, growing our labour force, rather than just declaring success, taking back £2 billion of underspend. This is a short-term saving, but a long-term cost. It's a poor investment decision. We need to invest that money, grow our labour force, and there are ways that we can do that. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour around the report. So I'm going to stop now, but really interested in whether that resonates with people's thoughts, and also building on these ideas about what we can do about it. But back to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, we've had lots of good questions coming in already, so you can get your thinking cap on with some of those, because there's some excellent questions being posed, which I shall return to after Jonathan. So Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much for joining us. MP for Leicester South, MP since 2011, and former Shadow Health Secretary, but currently Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Sam, and that was an excellent and superb presentation. I'm sorry I've arrived late at the event. We were delayed here in Parliament because there was a leak from the roof of the Commons, which led to a downpouring of water onto the benches where the Prime Minister would routinely sit, and they had to put a bin between the dispatch box and where the Prime Minister would routinely sit, which overflowed and touched the carpets and the benches where the Prime Minister would routinely sit. So make of that metaphor whatever you like, whatever you will, for the state of what's been going on here in Parliament in recent days. So look, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm really pleased to be responding to the presentation and to be responding to the publication of reports. And I am all thrilled to associate myself with the Learning and Work Institute, because for over 100 years, the Institute and your predecessor organisations have been at the heart of the debate of how to equip workers with the skills to find work and crucially progress at work. And of course, it was over 100 years ago when you were founded at a time of great economic insecurity, given the international event of the time, from a savage war and a legal pandemic raging. And today we meet again in times of great economic insecurity and turbulence, a period of high inflation, with more increases in and painful increases in energy bills to come, more food price increases in the shops, and the rising cost of living outpacing wage growth against a very volatile international backdrop, both in terms of security, but both in terms of the pandemic that has hit us over the last 2 years. The response of government to inflation in the United Kingdom, to the extent we can fathom any coherent government approach at all, is to strip demand from the economy through tax increases and working hand in hand with the Bank of England increasing interest rates. Although you will have seen in the last 24 hours a whole parade of ministers who have supported various tax increases, now committing themselves each to 30 to 40 billion pounds worth of tax cuts, with no explanation as to how they're going to pay for them. Anyway, let's leave that to one side for a moment. But what I want to do in my remarks is argue that we need a proper employment plan, that we need modern supply side reforms to increase employment, tame inflation, to make our economy more productive and raise living standards in a sustainable way. That means reforming the way we provide employment support to raise participation in the labour market now. And it means helping prepare us for the future, what I describe as the 3 Ds: decarbonisation, digitisation, and demographics. Decarbonisation, where we'll need new support, training, and help so workers are ready to take advantage of the new jobs, the green heat of future technologies, if you like, that help us transition to net zero. Digitisation, where there is a risk of more low-paid service sector jobs and a gulf between these and higher-paid work, with fewer routes to advance from the bottom, where there are fewer routes to advance from the bottom to the top, and this becomes ever more ensconced than it already is in our economy. And of course, demographics, where we know that our population is aging with a greater cohort of older people, but also all of us are living longer as well. So aging and longevity could lead to us being short of around 2.6 million workers by 2020. So we need reforms both to protect our living standards today and reforms to protect our living standards tomorrow. And myself and my colleague Alison McGovern, who's our Shadow Employment Minister, wants to lead a discussion and a dialogue with you and everybody in the sector about what these reforms ought to look like for an incoming Labour government. Because let me be clear, or let me be clear on behalf of my colleagues, unemployment for us is never a price worth paying. Worklessness devastating for individuals. I'll never forget myself queuing up in the old Dole office with my dad in the 80s. Ongoing joblessness wrecks lives and is a crushing waste of talent. It's why I'm so passionate about providing real employment opportunities for all, so that families can build a good life and provide a home for themselves. But the way in which we provide employment support is failing. And this is something we have been highlighting in the House of Commons, and my colleague Alison has been highlighting. Overall employment is down since the pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of over 50s have left the labour market altogether, and the numbers of those on out-of-work benefits is 1 million higher. The analysis you have published today is stark and frankly skewers recent ministerial boasting of a jobs miracle. The UK has seen the biggest drop in its employment rate in major G7 economies. Hundreds of thousands of over 50s have left the labour market, and with the UK as an international outlier, seeing the biggest drop in over 50s in the workforce of 10 major countries studied. There are now twice as many people economically inactive due to sickness as there are unemployed people. These three facts from your report should be the top of any candidate for Prime Minister's agenda, although I suspect, sadly, they're not. Earlier this year, the TUC explored the drivers of this so-called silver exodus from the labour market, and they found a growing number of the over 50s leaving for reasons of long-term sickness or disabilities, as you've identified as well. For others, it was retirement or caring responsibilities. And worryingly, the TUC's analysis highlighted the sharp inequalities in the group of over 50s in the labour market. Of those leaving for reasons of ill health or caring responsibilities, a high proportion are in lower paid occupational groups working in process, plant or machinery operators, and elementary occupations, including cleaners, security guards, call centre workers. And the TUC have calculated that almost 1 in 3 older people who are active due to health problems come from these sectors. Now, we also know there are inequalities within this as well. Black, Asian and minority ethnic workers are less likely to retire early than white workers. Those that do leave the labour market earlier are more likely to do so because of poor health or caring responsibilities. Older women, who historically have higher rates of activity than older men anyway, but the proportion of older women leaving the labour market for caring responsibilities has been higher for men historically, but there is also some evidence that some men are leaving the labour market for caring responsibilities as well. And of course, as you say, there are a number of 50s who have left the labour market for reasons of retirement. Many cashing in defined contribution pensions, although this doesn't tell us whether they have other sources of income, but it does suggest this cohort of older people are not using their pension freedom to provide a sustainable retirement over the long term. They're using it to help themselves get by. Now, why is all of this a problem? Well, we've seen in the past what being at work at this age means for people in terms of their health, financial stability, and mental well-being. And we know from the past that then when this group of people leave work, they're least likely to return to work. And I also believe that if we're forcing over 50s out of the labour market, it's a waste for society as well, undermining our sense of common purpose. Holds our economy back when we have so many workforce shortages with vacancies at a record high, inflation ravaging living standards. So how should we respond? Well, I've committed the next Labour government to a strategy for ageing, and supporting the over 50s return to work will be a key plank of that. Now, as a former Shadow Health Secretary, it's no surprise to me that years of squeezing healthcare capacity have left us with 6.5 million on waiting lists for treatment and over 3,000 waiting for over a year. I long warned that these huge waiting lists, ballooning waiting lists, risk permanent disability for many working people, forcing them out of the labour market. And I believe we're seeing this with the cohort of some of these over 50s who will no doubt be waiting for operations such as hip replacements or knee replacements. My Labour colleague, Wes Streeting, is developing a detailed plan to bring waiting lists down, and I'll be working closely with Wes, as I believe more can be done to provide better support for those who have left the labour market, but can help to return with the right help in place. Mental ill health is now one of the biggest drivers of absence from work, which is this morning, been at Central and North West London's NHS Trust's employment services, looking at their schemes of how they better link employment support with community mental health providers. And what they were telling me this morning is that they're increasingly finding more of the over 50s presenting with mental health problems who also need help with employment support and are keen to move back into work with the right level of support. I've also been seeing programmes like in Southampton, where local government, the NHS and the Department of Work and Pensions work together to help more people move into work who otherwise would not have been. Expert evaluation has shown that for every £1 spent on the Southampton initiative, it resulted in economic benefits of £1.76. So reformed employment service I want to build would not only offer specialist tailored help to the over 50s who want to return to work, but would be better integrated with local government and local health services. And I want to launch a conversation today about what that could look like in practice and how we could build on the success of the pilot schemes that I've been talking about and visiting. I'm also aware, of course, that given concerns about COVID transmission, ensuring older people feel safe in the workplace is key to persuading older people to return to the workplace as well. The Health and Safety Executive, which falls under the remit of the Department of Work and Pensions, must be properly supported to ensure legal obligations to assess and manage risk in the workplace, and I'd want to see that enforced as the Secretary of State. But despite this silver flag, as some have called it, from the workplace, the ONS reports, as I've been hearing, that 6 in 10 people in their 50s would be prepared to return to the labour market if the right flexibility existed. And this is where I think the New Deal for Working People that the Labour Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, has launched, with the right to flexible work at its heart, is so important. People living longer brings with it great opportunities, and we should celebrate longevity. But we have to recognise it also brings big challenges as well, particularly for those if we want to retain people in the workplace. But retaining I'll explain that in a second, but retaining older people in the workplace is the workforce is good for employers, bringing benefits and experience, and it's good for the economy, boosting overall growth. But we know longevity naturally has problems. 1 in 3 people born today will go on to develop dementia. Many of us will be confronted with the need to care for a loved one or a parent, a partner at some point in our lives. And just as important as the need to care for loved ones, whether it's dementia or perhaps a loved one who's had a stroke or something of that nature, just as important to understand the implications for that, people say in the workplace, I think policymakers are also finally waking up to begin to appreciate the importance of menopause support and menopause policy in the workplace as well. So the reason I'm mentioning both these examples is that it's right, in short, it's right that people should have a right to flexibility. And I believe that will become even more important in the future if we want to retain older workers. And what that looks like in statutory terms is something I'm working closely with my colleague Angela Rayner on, who leads on that for the Labour Party. Finally, retraining. Someone in their 50s could well want to work for another 50 or even more years if the right training was available. My colleague, Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillips, has asked David Blunkett, former Education and Employment Secretary, to produce a strategy to ensure they are equipped for the skills and challenges of the future. And I've been discussing with Bridget and David directly how we retrain and keep older people in the workforce. And his report is coming out later this year, I suspect probably in the autumn now. So with a cost of living crisis raging, these are the kinds of welfare employment reforms that I want to pioneer as a reformer to help people back into work and progress at work. We cannot abandon a generation of people to worklessness, just as happened in the past. Genuine full employment will be a driving mission of the next Labour government. And as a reformer, I'll ensure those out of work, including the over 50s, and those who have fallen out of work since the pandemic, and perhaps are sick, receive the real support they need as part of our plan to grow our economy and sustainably raise living standards, giving people the security they deserve. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Jonathan. And thank you for launching this conversation with us at Learning and Work Institute today. Some really great ideas there. And we've had lots and lots of questions, some very popular questions coming in, also from the audience. So I'm going to pose some of those now, if that's okay. The first one is really targeted at you, Jonathan, but Stephen, I wonder if you could give your reflections afterwards on what you think as well. Jonathan, so you sort of alluded to working with Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting, some of your other colleagues, and something that really does concern the sectors, I should say, is about breaking down policy silos. So really working across those policy agendas. So the first question is, how would Labour ensure that there is a joined up approach? You have talked about some of that. The question specifically says skills and employability, which are two big areas, but I, as chair, will also throw in health into the equation there because of what we've been talking about today. So I wonder if you would just stop a moment on that, sort of breaking down those silos. And first, Jonathan, and then Stephen, I'll turn to you on that one.
Yeah, so we absolutely have to work together. And I think there are two issues that we're facing. So there's a question that we are grappling, which my colleague Alison McGovern is putting a lot of thought into, which is what is the future of the job centre, and do we need to reform Job Centre Plus, and whether it's realistic that Job Centre Plus should be delivered from the desk in Whitehall, and whether local leaders, whether that's a combined authority level or a different level, should have more control over local Job Centre Plus and the way in which it delivers support to help job seekers move into work. But we've also got a cohort of people who, as Stephen was saying, some of these people not on the job seeking family of benefits, may not be claiming any benefits at all, or maybe on the family of what was ESA support group set of benefits, and because there is a degree of migration going on in the benefit system, we're not quite in a period where we can be absolutely precise about all these different, but the points I'm making about the sort of families of benefits, if I can put it like that. I think that when you've got a group of people who are designated as economically inactive, and you are not doing anything to support those to move back into work, even find out if they want to move back into work, I think we've got an issue, particularly when we know that in order to create a more productive economy and sustainably raise living standards and maintain a stability in the cost of living, we need to increase our labour size, modern supply side reform that we need to pursue. But I'm not doing this simply not because of dry economic reasons, but I believe that particularly people who are suffering from a mental health condition, their quality of life in the right circumstances can be immeasurably improved by finding the right type of work, not through the old way of threats and sanctions, but by support and a personalised approach. And I think what I bring to this in the role of Work and Pension Secretary is 5 years experience working in the health policy field. And I think we can work much closely together. I'm very well aware that attempts at integrated working with a health service, the NHS, can sometimes be slow and frustrating. The NHS is a wonderful organisation that does wonderful things every minute of the day. But sometimes trying to get it to work in a different way with new parts of the state or different parts of the state, like I know can be a time-consuming process, but I'm absolutely convinced that if you have a better link up between, for example, mental health services and employment support, as has been piloted, or as we've seen in some pockets of the country, we can do a lot more for people. Equally as well, we have to have a better integration skills, and I think the lessons of government. I say this as someone who worked for the previous Labour government as an advisor, is that I'm still not convinced if governments of the last 30 years, 40 years, have found the correct way to integrate a skills agenda properly with their work agenda. And we've tried different approaches over 30, 40 years. We've had a Department of Education and Employment. We've had a department, universities and skills. We've had, lots of different iterations of this. But it's absolutely vital that here to hit these big challenges which are confronting us, what I describe as the 3Ds, decarbonisation, the demographic challenges, and the digitisation challenges, we're going to have to better integrate skills and how we provide employment support. So yes, I'm absolutely convinced in this way of working. And look, the DBP in and of itself is not going to resolve the issues facing the over 50s or the long-term sick, particularly if it's about mental health. And mental health is going to be, by 2030, worldwide, mental health is going to be, according to WHO, mental health is going to be the biggest reason for morbidity and absence from the workplace. So it's absolutely vital that we get better at working more closely together. So sorry, that's probably a bit of a waffly answer, but I hope the audience on the digital audience can appreciate that I'm actually determined that we pursue this integrated working to deal with the challenges that face us.
Yeah, and that the reasons behind it, why it needs to be joined up, and how we can go about that. And there will be a wealth of experience from the audience as well. And with you sort of saying that this is a start of a conversation, I'm sure there'll be people willing to engage and share their experience with you as well. Jonathan, Stephen, any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Right, I agree with a lot of what Jonathan was talking about there around you kind of you need some shared outcomes at national government level, but also you can't do all this stuff at national government level, and you do it by doing it and by showing the win-wins for both sets of services, whatever they happen to be sometimes. But let me give a couple of concrete examples. By the way, I think sort of arguing for and writing about the need to integrate employment and skills, which is something I've been doing for a while. It's probably one of the few jobs for life, I think, actually these days. But so two concrete examples. So number one, there are 1 in 5 adults who've got low literacy or numeracy, and half of them are out of work. So that's probably about 4 million people of working age across England. Let's take England. Now, in the very best employment programme, you will get maybe 50% of people into work by the end of it, which means that 50% won't. That's my numeracy coming through there. So 1 in 2 people in those employment programs won't have a job by the end. So shouldn't we at the very least have helped them to improve their literacy and numeracy? So what about an essential skills guarantee for everybody going through the benefits system, the employment system? That's something you could build into it. At national level, it's something that local and combined authorities could do as well. That's example 1. Example 2, so Jonathan mentioned career changing, and this is kind of both a thing through the pandemic as the economy changes, but also a longer term thing as we have longer working lives and lots of change going on. And yet the number of career changes has fallen since 2008. So all this kind of stuff about job hopping millennials kind of hasn't quite borne out in the data, so it's dropped. And it feels to me like this is a massive gap in policy where the DfE and the DBP really need to work together. So for example, shouldn't apprenticeships be a great way for people in mid-career to change sectors? But wouldn't that look a little bit different to the current set of apprenticeships that we've got and apprenticeships for younger people? And might you give a bit of extra financial support to people who've paid into the national insurance system for 20 years or whatever to help them with the living costs of making that transition, which otherwise they might not be able to afford because they've got rent or mortgages or family commitments or whatever. So I tend to think in sort of practical terms about what we can do about some of these things. So there's 2 examples as a start of a 10.
Stephen. Now we've got two questions which I'm going to roll into one because they both concern the same thing, which is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which just also happens to be my favourite topic of conversation. So we've got 2 questions here because what came before, the European Social Fund, did aim to tackle some of the issues that we've been talking about, economic inactivity, particularly amongst certain groups. The question being, would an answer to some of this potentially be boosting the Shared Prosperity Fund in 23-24, as opposed to the current government policy, which waits till 24-25 to be able to help in what they're calling their people and skills objective? And Fiona Aldridge also makes a similar point of the UK Shared Prosperity funds and timing restrictions, which need urgent review. Shall I come to you first, Stephen, and then go to Jonathan? Is that okay?
Yeah, so I think the government decision to end ESF and then wait a year before bringing in your UK Shared Prosperity Fund for this sort of activity is it feels to me like a mixture of bonkers and baffling, really. I can't understand the thought process behind it. I think my argument, I mean, there's two things. So one is I used to commission and also be in an organisation that delivered European Social Fund programmes. So I kind of know that there were various ways in which they were a pain in the what's it, and the rooms filled with the paperwork for decades, it felt like. So there was a lot of stuff, and short term and too bureaucratic. Now a fair chunk of that was imposed by the UK government rather than the EU, but we'll leave that behind. So this was a real opportunity to think differently and invest a bit longer term and to integrate it with existing provision and all the other stuff going on, rather than a standalone set of 2-year projects. And so I just feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity post-Brexit to do things a little bit differently, because it feels like they've just allocated it according to similar sets of criteria that the EU did, and then done 2-year blocks of funding that are a bit short-term and disjointed from everything else. So it feels like a missed opportunity, which leads on to the second thing. Now, I don't know, my argument is that we need more investment in employment and skills, and specifically at this economic inactivity challenge. Where that comes from is really important, but the first thing is we need some more of it, and we should put it where it makes the most impact, which may be doing ESFE type things, or it may be expanding existing employment programs or something else. We've also argued for greater devolution of some of this. So, for example, could you get a single pot? There's so many pots of funding, or if you think of any 3 letters, it probably either is, has been, or will be a skills and employment program shortly. So can we simplify some of these things into a single pot, a bit like Michael Heseltine argued for under the previous strand of the Conservative government, and judge local areas on the outcomes that they deliver rather than the pots of funding that they manage to administer. So we need more funding, we need more investment, but it needs to be in a joined up, coherent way rather than just this strand or that strand.
Yeah, getting rid of some of this fragmentation and shiny new pots of money that aren't actually new, and what are they going to do? Jonathan, do you have views on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point is really well made. What I've been surprised about when I came into this brief 6-7 months ago and started to look into the detail of this, it's just how many different pots of money there are, how it's utterly fragmented, and how there is widespread confusion as to which bits are responsible for which, who commissions which, and I'm not convinced we get the most efficient use of all these different pots of money. I really would want to look at them all. The problem, of course, is some of these pots of money are delivered by different departments, and it's these always lead to tensions within governments, with different departments getting very departmentalist about their pots of money. But I do think this has to be looked at in the round, because we are failing on employment support. What you effectively identified in your report is the levels of hidden worklessness in our country. And we've had we've seen secretaries of state come along now for 10 years, and in fairness, even under the previous Labour government, talking about the 2.5 million to 3 million or so, for example, on ESA support group, or whatever the predecessor or successor benefit might be, and saying we need to support people and help people get back to work. And and other than sending out threatening messages around sanctions and so on, which is not the approach that I would take, we've never really seen I don't think, on a large scale, nationwide scale, a workable, sensible system of employment support to help people find work if they want to find work. I think we've got no option but to confront these questions, simply because of the demographic challenge we are facing. Longevity Institute is predicting, I think, a shortage of 2.5 million workers by 2030. I mean, there's obviously different things that have slightly different predictions, but they're all in the same. We're all heading in the same direction. If some of these over 50s who have left the labour market, you know, are retiring early and drawing down DC pensions and so on, it may well be that that will be a bridge to some other retirement income. We don't know, but it may well be that we're storing up a cost of living crisis for the future for this particular lot of people. So having a proactive service that gives people the support and helps them find the flexible work that is suitable for them, I think is really, really important as part of our strategy, both to help individuals have a better quality of life, but also tackle the inflation and raise living standards sustainably. And I hope that answers Anna's question, and I hope this doesn't embarrass her, but she could have asked me an action on the school run in Leicester when she often bumps in me. I hope I haven't embarrassed her by saying that.
Well, maybe she'll ask you on the school run as well, and you'll see if the answer's the same. Brilliant. So in our answers, we've talked about, you know, national, local, but there's been a couple of questions that sort of tackle this head on, and I wonder, Jonathan, I'll turn to you first. So in looking at these labour market issues, are there some that do need to be tackled nationally? Are there some that should be devolved? And there's another question that says, are you in favour of greater devolution potentially to local job centres and local authorities? Now, you sort of mentioned that Alison McGovern is looking at some of this already, but just thinking about layers of government and what gets done where. Any thoughts on that? And then, Stephen, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, we are absolutely up for this. If we can get a system where the wiring of it works, I strongly believe that local leaders, democratically accountable, should be able to make decisions about what is in the needs of their local economies in terms of jobs and skills. We, as a incoming working pensions team, need to think about how a benefits budget, which is an AIMI budget, operates in a system where some of this is devolved. This is not like devolving a DEL budget where you say to a local area, here's the money for skills, you get to spend it, because, you know, people applying for job seekers related benefits, it's part of a national system. What is the local role of a job centre in that? These questions that we're want to debate and have a discussion, but in principle, I think local leaders, and whether that is combined authorities, whether that is a smaller level, whether that's a group of authorities coming together. Look, these are things we're prepared to discuss, but instinctively, I'm a devolver and want to see devolution if we can get it right. So these are things where I suppose my invitation to the people in the meeting is that come and talk to us about it. We want to hear your ideas. We want to develop together, because, you know, the worst thing in policy is when ministers walk into a department, think know it all, and implement harebrained schemes which are not based on expert opinion, and have not been discussed and developed with experts field. So we do want to have this conversation with the Learning Institute and the other organisations who are represented here today. Fantastic.
Thanks, Jonathan. Stephen, thoughts on devolution?
Yeah, I mean, you can have the sort of, I think there's probably different gradations of this, isn't there? So you can have local authorities or local areas perhaps responsible for coordinating some of the provision and some of the various sort of policy strands that are there now. And then the question is, well, how do you get that to have teeth rather than a bit of a talking shop? You can have a sort of middle strand, if you like, or level, which is the single pot thing that I was talking about before, underpinned by an outcomes agreement. That's what they do in Canada, for example. Or you can go maximalist, and this gets a little bit what Jonathan was talking about in terms of Adele and Amy and these sort of different sources of budgets, where you sort of so this is what they do in the Netherlands. So you give a combined authority or something or other, here's all the money, including people's benefit payments. If you do really well at getting more people into work, better than we expect, you can keep the savings and do what you like with it. If you don't do very well, you're going to have to raise taxes locally to pay for it. And that's the bit that would require some extra devolution over tax powers, for example. So I think there's different levels you can do some of this at. I did want to sort of briefly flag a point about this. I've talked a lot about getting people into work in the first place, but there is the point about stopping people dropping out of work as well, which I think is important, and particularly, for example, if you develop a health condition when you're in work. And that gets us back a little bit to, we were having some discussions in the pandemic about the need to fix the sick pay system, and then we didn't do it, or the government didn't do it rather. So I think there is a point about the sick pay system, and there is a point about occupational health support, and there is a point about supporting employers to adapt jobs if people develop conditions or whatever it happens to be. So again, all of this says you need some local relationships, because you can go and talk to M&S or John Lewis headquarters or whatever, but it's actually the local branch that's making some of these decisions in practice, and that says local relationships, whoever that happens to be. So you always get this sort of bridge, I think, between national and local. I'd like to see a national framework of service standards that people can expect, and some clear data on whether they're being met, and then some greater local flexibility in how they're delivered according to my sort of 3 levels of devolution. There you go, I've invented a model as we spoke.
The 3 levels of devolution, there's a bit tighter. Great. I think we've got only time for one more question, and actually, Stephen, this is really one for you on the report itself, but it is a general question from Susan Fay, which is around, what will people, because of the cost of living crisis that we're also experiencing, will people just naturally go back to work? Those who've dropped out, will they drop in? What implications does that have? Do we need to think about that? And that ties to a question that I sort of had, which is, will these trends naturally continue? And if left unchecked, what might those impacts be that we see? Stephen.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was talking about this a little bit earlier, actually. So I think it may well be that people made these decisions to drop out of the labour market when inflation was 2, 3, 4%, and it's now, sort of heading up to 10+%, and interest rates are up, and universal credit's been cut or hasn't been uprated in line with inflation, and the uplift was taken away, and etc. etc. Stock markets are down if people are relying on early access to pensions. So it may well be that some people in this over 50s group say, oh, do you know what, I'm going to have to work. The question is, where are they going to go for help to do that? Some of them may be able to just find a job that they want in and of themselves and not need any help. But others, are they going to go to the job centre? If so, they're going to have to sign on for benefits, and are they going to meet all the rules that they're going to want to do that? Or where are they going to go? So this says to me, there may be an increased latent demand, if you like, to go back to work or find a new job, but we still need to put that investment in for the support. And some of it's Job Centre Plus, but not all of it can be.
Yeah. Any final thoughts from you, Jonathan?
I think that's a really, really important point. The economic environment has changed drastically since some of these decisions would have been made, really drastically. And we don't know where we're heading with inflation. I mean, Bank of England's, central banks feel that we'll be able to get through this, but it's very noticeable that the Bank of England's expectations for inflation have proven to be really quite wrong in recent months. If we are now in a period of high inflation and difficulties with the cost of living, people's savings, people's DC pension pots, etc., are going to be extremely, extremely stretched. And we may well have a whole bunch of over 50s knocking on the doors of job centres saying, help is it for me? And I just don't think that we're remotely prepared for that. I know the government sort of rushed out sort of press release last week saying we're offering sort of MOTs and so on, but I don't think really scratching the surface on what is needed. And I think it does come back to this. You know, we need a new approach to how we provide employment support. We need a new approach to how people can access the training that they need. We need a new approach from employers in order to retain, retrain, and recruit, and that a lot of that comes down to flexibility. I mean, I'm sure everybody on this call has a family member or knows somebody in their 50s who is squeezed at both ends. They're caring for a parent, an elderly parent. They might not be with dementia, just may well be a frail elderly parent, and they may well be doing more caring for their grandchildren. You know, so the high cost of childcare for their children in their 20s and 30s impacts on over 50s out of the workforce as well, of course. I think we need to be looking at the way in which people's right, where we offer proper rights for flexible working. People. And the other thing is, although I mentioned it, we haven't really picked up on this in the discussion. I think it's don't underestimate the extent to which for women, menopause and lack of support, lack of flexibility around that is also having impact. And that is something that's begun to be debated here in Westminster, thankfully, after years of sort of being kind of ignored. But I really think that to fix this, you've got to work across what the statutory rights in the workplace, what is it the WP does with its employment support systems, what it is we do through healthcare, and what it is we do through skills. So we have to have an integrated approach. And I think I'm very much committed to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jonathan and Stephen. Thank you for the very excellent discussion at the end of this afternoon, and thank you everybody for sending in your questions. I hope I did the most of them justice there, but there were other ones, Jonathan, for you to have a look at and see what else people sent in. It only goes, thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us. Thank you, Stephen, for setting out the report, and thank you everybody for joining us for this event. Cheerio, have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.